All right, let's look at the Cold War. And now we're getting into something that is what I grew up in, so obviously we've had to teach ourselves about it, this area of history, which is not always easy to do, but after you live so long, I guess you do get a perspective. But anyway. Okay, the United Nations. The declaration, remember, was made on the first day of 1942, but no formal organization was established until World War II was ending in April 1945 at San Francisco, and became an official international organization in that year, April of 45 in San Francisco. But this time, unlike the League of Nations after World War I, this time all nations of the world were invited to join, well, except for the defeated powers at first, but their options were open as they reconstructed. But be that as it may, as always in history so far, the great powers predominated. I mean, they're the ones with the wherewithal, in particular, you know what country, which again, after the First War, was the United States, the only creditor nation left in the world, and now, make no doubt about it, the dollar becomes the international currency, as it still is, as a consequence of World War II. But, be that as it may, UN becomes a forum for all nations to air their grievances and concerns. Of course, where does it have to be located? What country? America, obviously, over here. We're paying for it and everything else, and that's the way it's been. So we have post-war hegemony. Now, when the war ended, it was clear to everybody that only two nations really came out of it as the big winners, and that was the United States and the Soviet Union. And so the term superpower was created as a single word, and it fit the categories quite well. Unfortunately, within months, maybe a year or so, it became obvious that the two countries were totally irreconcilable, at complete odds, as we had been in the war aims, remember, why we fought World War II, what we were both trying to achieve. The United States, democratic, capitalistic, established political clones of itself. Clone is a word we didn't know in those days, but now we do, and that's a good description of the nations that the Western troops, Allied troops, liberated, were immediately turned into democratic countries. Free elections were held, and the British, of course, supported us. Britain now, a much weaker power, broken by the war. No, we didn't realize that at first, and the British didn't either, but very soon it became obvious that Britain was in trouble. But, of course, it turns out that this is the countries where our armies were, the British, French, and American armies were located right through Germany, almost central Germany, all the way down here to the Adriatic Sea. So all nations, well, not most nations behind it. Spain still fascist, but who cared, because it didn't really matter, small country. But France, reconstructed, liberated, now becomes a republic again, having thrown off the German yoke. Western Germany was occupied by Allied forces. Italy, of course, is back in the family of nations, and of course turned out to be a winner after flirting with Mussolini. But that's basically its sphere of influence. Of course, Britain, there it is, but it's Western Europe is the American part of Europe. But let us also add now the dimension of the Pacific Ocean. By the end of World War II, the Pacific had become an American lake. Make no mistake about it, we wouldn't even let the Russians in to Japan to reconstruct its government. I mean, we had agreed to let them in, but when we realized what was going on, the Russians, the heck with it. So the United States occupies Japan, the Philippines, gave the Philippines independence right away in 1946, and immediately started to transform Japan into a democracy. The USSR, let's just say the Soviet Union, Soviet Russia, Same old story, same old dictator, Joe Stalin, whose Red Army had, well, I'll use the term liberated, all of Eastern Europe up to this line, including Berlin, and set up, therefore, as the Soviet Union said, democratic nations behind the Russian lines. But what, of course, that was were communist nations that were imposed by Russia. And that meant that there's no democracy at all in it. And what the Russians were doing is the thing they've been looking for their entire history. And I've beaten this point to death, but it's the important thing to realize, the paranoia of the Russian people. Now they're never going to allow another Hitler or Napoleon to invade and devastate. Therefore, they're creating a strategic buffer zone of the countries of Eastern Europe. The Red Army does not go home. Most of the United States Army did, but the Red Army stays there and protects these clones of Soviet Union. And this includes, of course, all the countries in the East, and you see them here, of course, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia here. Austria was kind of neutral, and she was allowed to do what she wanted to become a democracy, as it turned out. The Serbian area, Yugoslavia, of course, which is still a country, Bulgaria, Romania, everything, Poland, everything to the east in the Soviet sphere, occupied by the Russian army. The result of this was the Cold War. In 1946, in February of that year, Winston Churchill, who had been deposed as prime minister, that is, he wasn't reelected as the war was ending. People get sick of wartime leaders because they make so many sacrifices, the people, in a democracy. We, of course, changed hands because Franklin Roosevelt died in April of '45 of total exhaustion. And Churchill came to Fulton, Missouri, and made a speech, famous speech, in which he said, "An iron curtain has descended across Europe." And that's the term used from that day forward to describe the Soviet occupation. He said, from Stettin on the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, great speaking voice, all the great capitals of Central and Eastern Europe have fallen to the Russian tiger, and all that stuff. An iron curtain has fallen across Europe, and behind that, dictatorship. Well, Churchill, if he was anything, a historian, a brilliant strategist, he understood exactly what had happened, and the Soviet Union and the United States were now squared off as superpowers against each other. No real shooting occurred, and that's the great blessing of this Cold War. It never really did, but always looming in the background, particularly after the Soviet Union exploded its first atomic bomb in 1949. We, of course, had dropped 2 on Japan in 1945. The fear of a thermonuclear World War III was always in the backs of everybody's minds. And that is one of the great values and benefits of nuclear weapons. We're too scared to use them, thank goodness.